So, hello and welcome. In this session, I'm really going to cover our guide to success for cloud ISP and SaaS transformation. So, let me narrow first kind of what I really mean when I say transformation, right? So, enterprises are always in a state of transformation, right? Somewhere in the business, but IT is at the center of some pretty dramatic change due to a few sources, right? One is we're changing the way that apps are accessed by implementing architectures like SASE, technologies like SD-WAN. And the other part that's kind of happening at the same time is we're changing where apps are hosted, right? We're moving internal apps to the cloud. We're adopting cloud and web apps, adopting hybrid architectures, or consuming SaaS specifically from third parties. And there are a few statistics from Gartner that I found that I wanted to highlight to help tell this story a little bit. So Gartner predicts 30% increase in enterprises deploying SASE architectures by 2024. Okay, technologies comprised within SASE are a pretty wide range and might still be a little bit up for debate, but it's clear that the hybrid work and pandemic shifts have changed what the edge is for the enterprise network. To the business, this is a move around security, right? But all the technologies like SD-WAN, proxies, firewalls support a change in connectivity, which ultimately is going to impact the digital experience, right? And adding to that is actually, in this case, a doubling of the number of companies able to shift specifically to only WAN connectivity via public internet. Now, this is going to be layered on with things like SD-WAN oftentimes, and this may not be true for all companies, but there are a number of offices maybe that can use direct to internet connectivity. And the last one is the one I want to highlight. By 2025, 70% of digital business initiatives will require reporting of business metrics on digital experience. And that's up from less than 15% today. Now, this is from the Digital Experience Market Guide. But I think the salient point here is that while it's a prediction, more and more of the enterprises that we work with have essentially found that the business is more willing to listen around initiatives when it is talking or is going to impact end user experience. And so what we want to kind of look at is the metrics that back those conversations up. And our customers have been able to drive success because they've been able to prove that they're either helping the end user experience or at least not hurting it. And that's kind of key to this short guide on a general approach of how to drive success for transformation. So let me level set on the largest IT initiatives today, right? The source of the transformation comes in those kind of 2 to 3 forms. I mentioned a little bit earlier. We're either changing where an application lives, right? Or we're changing how an application is delivered, right? If we're adopting SaaS, we're actually changing the app entirely. If we're just migrating to the cloud, we're now changing where it lives. And then we're worried about the connectivity and the connections to the applications themselves from users, locations around the world, where the connectivity profile is very different than it was in the past. And I think the last one that's maybe a little bit less so at this point is we're also changing a lot of where the user is sitting, right? The user in general is going to be sitting in an office. We're certainly still in pandemic times where that may not always be true. And we're certainly going to see more remote work in a lot of enterprises. However, generally, we're still going to see office-based communication in the future. So typically, the application changes of where they live and what apps are being adopted or changed kind of happen at the same times. And when it does, the enterprise actually has new challenges around visibility, right? When we rely on those third parties to deliver key parts of the application and network delivery chains, we're actually creating a bunch of blind spots. And that's something that AppNeta is uniquely suited to help with. But in general, there are still ways that the enterprise can take advantage of tooling they already have or just better policies around connectivity to make this work. So if we're changing this rapidly, we don't always have a good idea or a good sense of where we started, right? When it comes to performance and user experience, if we've done a transformation, we don't always know what was the performance before, right? And so one of the keys to success that I'll start with is to have a baseline of application performance before a transformation so that you have something to compare to afterwards, right? If you've just rolled out a new technology, you might even see a slight uptick in some metrics like latency, right? If you're moving technology into the cloud and it used to be hosted in a data center or on-prem, then yeah, you're going to see additional latency between the user and the application. But if you're also changing the way that you're connecting to the apps, maybe the apps were actually great performers for a few people in headquarters, but actually terrible performers for anyone in a branch office. Adopting cloud could actually allow you to disperse the application servers enough that it could increase performance for a number of those people as well. And these transformations, I'm going to be honest, are going to happen whether or not you have end user experience visibility. But it's difficult to prove the success of that beyond just a rollout. And if you can't prove the success with these kind of metrics and with the success of the actual rollout, then you're taking some risk. And so there's no guarantee that a transformation project is going to be successful, right? It may be complete, but whether or not it's successful is going to be important. So the risks are going to vary. But when we're talking about large changes to the app or the network infrastructure, it's helpful to know kind of what these risks are. And just a few that our customers have actually reported to us. So this is a list generated on them. First of all, missed deadlines, projects delayed due to not having a clear understanding, perhaps, of the scope, or causing the IT teams or operations teams to continue using legacy solutions longer than they had planned because of problems with a rollout. Hey, new or unintended issues where you're unable to understand or correlate kind of network traffic. This is a huge one for accidentally doing this. It's not something that always intended, but bringing up new issues that, yes, you're going to have new challenges to actually address, but at the same time, focusing on what new issues these are. And if they're around end user experience, we know that we can actually mitigate those a little bit earlier. Confidence in IT can be a huge one that is unintended and also can lead to huge consequences. So if there is a lack of confidence in major migrations or even just the efficiency of the IT department, that's a huge risk going down the road. Understanding this is really around the business, right? This can be architectural changes where those could be sorely needed, but if the business doesn't understand why they're being done, or doesn't have front end user impact, or it doesn't appear to be changing anything that is obvious, this is something that's a risk really in communication. It's something that we can bring up early and we can communicate better to actually make that successful. And the last one here is proof, right? Outside of the project, the cutover, the implementation, is there a way to quantify what that it had the desired impact, right? And didn't cause additional issues? Is there a way to actually prove that we were successful? And so with this feedback from customers, we actually saw an opportunity to help. And that's mainly around what I want to talk about today. As a monitoring solution, AppNeta, now by Broadcom Software, it's certainly a lens that we're using to approach this guide to transformational success. And so with that, the goal is to get IT and network operations to monitor earlier in the transformation, right? By monitoring earlier in the process and providing actionable insight into, apps, network, user performance, we're actually able to provide some of those key metrics for success around digital end user experiences. And this really breaks into kind of a few milestones that I have outlined here. So baselining app performance before the transformation, get an understanding of what the current state of the network and the applications are, right? This was interesting in a few organizations where we actually uncovered some differences between the expectation and the reality, including finding, that while performance in headquarters was good, some branch offices really dealt with poor performance or far degraded performance, but it kind of learned to tolerate it. They kind of learned that was what they had expected, and no one really reported that to IT, right? Next, we want to validate the changes as they're done, right? Monitoring during a WAN cutover right? Or monitoring maybe when the first policies are put in place in a pilot phase, we can provide that third-party validation to where traffic was flowing, how users were impacted, and if apps were actually reachable in that end-to-end path from user to server. And that's going to be happening while the rollout is happening or actually immediately afterwards, just so you can prove that that change was successful. And then ongoing continuous monitoring afterwards, right? And this is really where we're starting to build new baselines for app and network performance. We're going to be able to compare it to the before state because now we've been monitoring earlier and shift towards kind of a proactive posture where we can start to look at degraded networks before they actually impact users. And that's really what we want to get to, is that proactive posture. And it's something that, while you may not always be able to mitigate problems before they happen, you will be able to be on top of that when users actually notice the problem. So that's the high level, right? Let's talk about some of the concrete advice and metrics that AppNeta and Broadcom Software recommend paying attention to as basically the pieces that are going to be able to drive the success of this transformation. So first, how do you baseline the performance of business critical applications or services really prior to the transformation? And the first idea is always going to be measure. You need to understand what applications are being used by employees across locations. This can be actually achieved in a few ways. One of the ways that we found, due to the age of shadow IT, where departments will start using apps without really telling IT, we've been using passive traffic monitoring, deep packet inspection, and application identification to figure out what apps are in use and start cataloging those top apps, categorize them maybe by function, and also look at the weight or the impact on the network. So how big are these apps? Are they, voice video conferencing where we're actually putting a lot of traffic on the network, or are they backup? Or are they, very, very small transactions that we don't have to worry about as much? And this is a really good way to understand not only apps, but their impact and their impact on user experience, right? There are two main categories of apps in this area that I want to talk about, right? High severity, but low usage. These are apps that are critical to someone's day-to-day work. And it might only be a small department, single person or a business unit. But if they can't connect to that application, they're stuck, they're done, right? And these often show up pretty quickly as IT tickets, right? If someone can't use their business critical app, they're probably going to let you know. And so having a concrete understanding on where those apps are hosted, how the application delivery path actually occurs, where users sit that are using those apps, that's going to be really important for those high severity, low usage apps. The other one is the polar opposite, right? Low severity, high usage, right? These are apps that everyone uses, but if they go down or have slow performance, it may not actually be a problem if it's only for a few minutes. We can weather disruptions with these apps. And I tend to put some project planning apps, even email sometimes, into this bucket where they have the largest employee footprint, sometimes all employees, but they aren't going to be something that stops them in their tracks, right? And it also serves as a great way to compare users with these applications because everyone uses them across multiple locations, across different business units, and with different use cases. And so when I said across regions, that's another piece here. So one of the most complicated things to isolate early on in the process when you're doing this monitoring and when you're doing these transformations is whether one user complaint is really the tip of the iceberg or actually just unique to that user, right? So it takes understanding of the networks and connective tissue that actually puts applications in users in views, but the initial kind of pre-transformation stage, it's important to identify some maybe representative examples of regions or places that you want to monitor during the transformation if it's going to affect some users more than others, right? Finally here, target goals. So one of the hardest things to do quantitatively, especially in this early stage, is before the transformation, getting a good, or maybe taking a good educated guess on what's going to happen to these metrics, what's going to happen to this performance. So if you're installing an SD-WAN, you should expect some additional latency just for processing overhead, right? Jitter loss should actually remain roughly constant or the same. We shouldn't actually see any impact there. If you're moving an app to the cloud, however, you may positively or negatively impact latency, round trip time, and some of these other metrics because you're introducing a small amount of, or maybe a large amount of hops and actual networks between your users and your applications. So these are some kind of hard stats you can look into. Again, it's all about expectations. So if I want to look at one key metric for beforehand, I would think about capacity, right? Achievable end-to-end bandwidth between the user and an application, between a source and a target. So it can be a location or a user or even a data center environment, and look and target something else that's critical, either the user location or maybe another data center. Maybe you're looking at transit between data centers, transit between headquartered and data centers, right? In this example, you can actually see that a cutover triggered a period of high utilized capacity. That's that dark blue reaching up to the light blue there. And this was for a remote user's connection that was unanticipated, right? But IT can kind of rewind, look what happened. And in this case, actually, I think what was happening was actually just a number of route changes, basically a switchover in the route. And so they can look at that and kind of identify that, maybe mirror it and figure out that it was as they were making a change to SD-WAN policies or maybe the connective tissue there. So in this case, it may be very obvious to the user that something's different, but you may not catch this unless you're looking for it specifically. So I had mentioned there's kind of the passive and the active side here. So the first one I'll show you is just around passive, right? This is listing all the top applications over this time span for a specific location. You can see there's actually 2 locations here on the right. And we have different reporting tools and kind of diagrams to help you understand if those top apps in use differ across locations or even business units. And this can be a great way to get an idea of what applications are in use. And second, looking at a wider view of kind of, this is an Office 365 dashboard. This is around service quality. So you can see in green, that's where the service was okay. Black lines would be where it's outage, where it's actually outage. And this is a good point to remember, is that apps don't really go down anymore. They can be slow, but oftentimes they're not going to be going down, right? Violation of performance SLAs of basically alert profiles. In this case, you can look closely here and see that while overall service has been good, the SLA that's down 8% at this point is actually pretty much attributed to a single location, just the Vancouver office in this case. So these are just a few ways we can baseline performance. We talk about active and passive. I think the key to this is the location-based component, because we know that performance is going to be variable depending on where users are and what services they're actually connecting to. So let's talk about our guide of what to consider during. Right, we talked about before. Let's talk about during a transformation. Right, during a rollout portion, or even during a pilot phase, one consideration we typically talk about and we start our conversations with is to have customers walk us through how they verify if their current environment will accommodate the planned transformation. And this is mainly around end user experience for us, but also just a general question that helps us understand what tools are in place, or if this is an initiative that's kind of passed down and they have to do it, it must succeed no matter what. And they're looking to kind of be successful by just completing the rollout. Right. So this brings me to a repeated piece here, or an idea, measure end user experience from the end user perspective can be crucial to quickly identifying problems during a rollout phase. Right. We also want immediate feedback. This also relates to having kind of mechanisms in place for that immediate feedback. This is primarily around active testing, right? Where we can get end user experience information and not be able to look at the kind of the bits and bytes of the change of like the actual changes, but by seeing if users would be impacted by this change instead of waiting for users to be impacted. By waiting for traffic to actually run over this network. And so you run a risk of unintended consequences or kind of lowering confidence in IT if you make a change overnight and then all of a sudden users come in and they see that there's a problem. And finally, during this stage, success reporting. It may seem early to start talking about that, but even in the middle stages, I want to focus on how we're looking at success and how we're reporting it, not only internally, but also to the business and to the users. We've had IT teams work on creating newsletters for these implementations, right? that communication can be key, because otherwise you're only hearing from IT when there's an outage or a problem or a change to your daily life. You're not hearing about success and kudos and making sure that everything's more secure, but also performant, right? By building in these success measures and stories, you can also kind of alert users to changes that they're now aware of. If they have performance problems, they might be able to help you troubleshoot because they know that this other thing is going on. Key metrics for this middle stage are maybe a bit more nebulous, as it really does depend on the type of deployment. Two that I wanted to highlight here that are helpful are AppDex scoring for application health, performance, and availability, as well as the mean opinion score. And this is generically for data traffic and voice traffic, just basically having some kind of comparative metric that we can use on both sides. I think with both of these, the data from the application side and the voice side will be enough to kind of give you an overview of core data types and if they're affected by any larger changes. So one example I wanted to give was actually a failure event during a transformation for a large healthcare provider that we work with. This customer had started to migrate its enterprise application workflows to Azure. Many of the applications that they were using were latency sensitive. So they wanted to be able to monitor the Azure environment and really understand the hosting environment. The customer was in the process of doing a WAN transformation where they're aggregating a bunch of different MPLS and connectivity types into a single MPLS vendor. And as is tradition, they were doing it over early morning off hours. And they were able to see issues immediately in AppNeta and showed, in this case, you can see increased loss, jitter, latency, round trip time, and actually a huge reduction in capacity to what they expected, from 1 gig all the way down to 200 meg. And so by seeing this, they were able to kind of stop the change and understand that they needed to either roll back or figure out the problem before users were actually impacted. And if you're not monitoring this type of thing, you're not going to see those capacity drops, because that's, not a unique metric, but it's something that's more difficult to get when you don't have user traffic on the links or on these connections. And so by using active monitoring, you can understand this before users are actually impacted. And this change actually highlighted an issue on, in this case, the MPLS provider side, right? A policy that changed the connection type that they were expecting. They were able to revert this change so that no users were actually impacted. But it's a good example of how knowing as quickly as possible can really help avoid end user experience issues and actually help success of the entire project, because you're avoiding these little micro failures along the way. So even though they had to roll it back and it was a failure, it allowed them to avoid issues and allowed them to kind of move forward with the project. So once we've made the kind of final transformations and changes live, we want to focus on a few things, right? Continuous testing. Now that we're running in kind of a steady state, this is where we can start monitoring SLAs. And we showed that application service kind of dashboard earlier. And I think that validation of SLAs is really, really helpful in understanding kind of proactively what end user experience looks like for these applications by location. Right. Business reporting. I'm going to repeat again here because, calling out the statistic earlier around business reporting, I think this is the time to focus on service quality and actually look at this. This is an opportunity to provide some of these tools, maybe even this data or access to the dashboard, to the application owners and let them understand the performance of their business critical applications, and let them be your eyes in identifying when things are degraded, or let them check instead of creating a ticket to figure out that things are, not graded or okay from their perspective. Right. It can be very useful in avoiding tickets in this case. And the last piece of advice, shouldn't be new to you, right? But it's a phrase that we often use around mean time to innocence. Right? It's crucial just after large transformations, in which it's very easy to have blame focused on the last technology that was implemented, right? We see this with SD-WAN all the time, but our customers often turn to the data that we can provide to exonerate the network, or even help other teams isolate where performance problems are and who might be able to fix it. So the key metric here, I'm going to bring back that service quality. I think this is the stage where we're beyond uptime and availability. We want to look at quality. We don't want to look at just outages. We want to see where the violations of performance with our SLAs or our kind of our alert profiles. If we think that's bad performance, we want to know about it. And so this is really about the ability to look at service quality, but also to look at it by location and find out if there are differences across different areas or if there's actually issues across the board. And this is actually a good time to bring up another customer example. This is an actually outage in a data center, right? They had started to look at Office 365 and actually jumped in a war room for 3 hours where they thought that Office 365 had to be the problem. There was an outage. It was right after a big OWA publicized hack, and they were really suspicious of Office 365. But ultimately, they brought AppNeta into the discussion. We were still in a proof of concept or a proof of value phase, weren't fully deployed, but we did have monitoring points on site and in their cloud. The data that we were able to show them within the first 15 minutes of live triaging with our solutions team, they are actually able to isolate the affected path and a specific time where the capacity drops, highlighted in red here, right? That allowed them to find a specific time of the root cause, which was actually a change to a Palo Alto firewall, right? The change that they had done is they had actually started inspecting zip files, but all of their developers had been uploading containers to their cloud environment via zip files. So all of a sudden they're basically inspecting gigs and gigs of additional traffic that they weren't before. But the developers haven't changed behavior. This likely was the way that they did things beforehand too, but now it's being inspected and it's actually causing a number of issues. So a great quote that I actually have from a different customer from Bristol Myers Squibb was when they visited AppNeta a ways back. There are a lot of tools out there that can show you green or red, right? If Salesforce or Oracle goes down, you don't need us to tell you that, right? There are going to be ways to figure that out, but we can show you yellow. And that's one of the prime examples of what we can help with, is showing you when things are degraded, but also understanding the performance before, during, and after. So hope I was able to share some of the customer wisdom when it comes to transformation. Our guide is pretty simple, but it involves planning and thinking ahead how the transformation you're embarking on will be measured, how it impacts your end users, and how you can take steps to prove the success of that transformation, even from the outset. And so with that, if you missed our POC this morning, it is available in the booth as a recording. We have a demo available there. We also have a short survey if you'd like to fill it out, 20 seconds for $5. It sounds like a good deal to me. And if you want to join me later today, I have a little bit more of an in-depth conversation as well as a product demo where we'll look into video conference and video and voice performance. But otherwise, I'll be around to take questions here or in the booth. But I'd like to thank you for your time today and have a good one.